Have you ever bought something you absolutely did not need, brought it home, used it maybe once or twice, and then watched it collect dust in the corner of your room? Yeah, we have all been there. And here's the thing that really gets me. It is not just you. It is not just me. It is literally everyone. Billions of people around the world are constantly buying things they do not need, things they will barely use, things that will not make them happier in any meaningful way. And yet, we keep doing it over and over again. So today I want to dig into the actual psychology behind why that happens. Because once you understand the machinery running underneath your buying decisions, you start to see the world in a completely different way. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you are going to look at your next purchase very differently. Let me start with something that happened to me personally. A while back, I was scrolling through my phone late at night, and I came across an ad for this sleek little kitchen gadget that claimed it could do about 12 different things at once. I did not need it. I had functioning tools in my kitchen already, but something about it just pulled me in. I watched the product video 3 times, I read the reviews, I added it to my cart, and by the time I actually stopped and asked myself why I was about to spend $40 on something I genuinely did not need, I had already spent 20 minutes completely emotionally invested in this object. That right there is not weakness. That is psychology working exactly as it was designed to work. So let us talk about what is actually happening in your brain when you encounter something you want to buy. The first concept I want to introduce you to is something called dopamine anticipation, and this is massive. When you see something you want, your brain doesn't actually release dopamine when you get the thing. It releases dopamine in anticipation of getting the thing. The wanting itself feels good. This is why shopping can feel exciting and almost electric, even before you've spent a single dollar. Neuroscientists have studied this extensively, and what they have found is that the reward circuitry in the brain lights up intensely during the browsing and anticipation phase. The moment you actually receive the purchase, the dopamine hit often drops significantly. This is part of why unboxing videos became such a massive phenomenon online, because watching someone else experience that anticipation and reveal moment triggers a similar neurological response in the viewer. The wanting phase is the high, the having phase is often the come down. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, and this is the part most people do not think about. Retailers, advertisers, and platform designers all know this. They have known it for decades. And so the entire architecture of modern shopping, whether that's a physical store or an app on your phone, is specifically engineered to extend and amplify that anticipation phase for as long as possible. The endless scroll on shopping apps is not accidental. The way Amazon shows you related products is not coincidental. The reason stores pipe certain scents through their ventilation systems and play specific tempos of music is because all of these sensory cues have been shown to increase browsing time and purchasing behavior. You're not just making a decision when you buy something unnecessary. You are being guided through a carefully constructed emotional experience designed to make that decision feel natural and even inevitable. Let us talk about something called retail therapy, because I think this term gets used very casually without people really understanding how deep it goes. When you're stressed, anxious, sad, or bored, shopping can feel like a genuinely effective short-term solution. And from a psychological standpoint, there is a real reason for that. Purchasing something gives you a momentary sense of control. When life feels chaotic or overwhelming, making a decision, even a small consumer decision like buying a new shirt or a candle, activates your sense of agency. You decided something. You acted on it. The world responded. That feedback loop feels stabilizing in the moment. Psychologists have documented this extensively, noting that people under chronic stress tend to make more impulsive and unnecessary purchases, not out of stupidity, but as a genuine coping mechanism. The problem, of course, is that it's a short-term fix with potentially long-term financial and emotional consequences. And this connects directly to another psychological concept I want you to understand, which is called the arrival fallacy. This was a term popularized by psychologist Tal Ben-Shahar, and it describes something most of us have experienced but never quite named. It's the belief that once we arrive at a certain destination or once we acquire a certain thing, we will finally feel satisfied, complete, or happy. I will feel better once I get this new jacket. I will feel more confident once I have that new laptop. I will feel like my apartment is finally together once I buy that specific lamp. The arrival fallacy tricks you into projecting your emotional well-being onto external objects. And the cruel irony is that when you actually get the thing, reality rarely matches the emotional promise you built around it. So you move on to the next thing, and the next. The purchase treadmill keeps moving not because the objects are failing you, but because the strategy of seeking emotional fulfillment through objects is fundamentally flawed from the start. Now, I want to spend a few minutes on something that is absolutely critical to understanding unnecessary purchases, and that is social identity. Human beings are deeply, deeply social creatures. We have evolved for hundreds of thousands of years in tight-knit social groups where our status within the group had very real survival implications. Being perceived a certain way mattered because it determined your access to resources, protection, and relationships. That ancient wiring doesn't just disappear because we now live in a modern consumer society. Instead, it gets redirected. The car you drive, the clothes you wear, the phone in your hand, the coffee brand you carry, all of these become signals. They communicate something about who you are, which group you belong to, what values you hold, what status you occupy. And even when we consciously tell ourselves we don't care what other people think, the research consistently shows that social signaling is one of the most powerful drivers of purchasing behavior. Economist Thorvin Veblen described something he called consumption-spicuous way back in the 1800s, and the concept remains startlingly relevant today. The idea is that people purchase and display goods not primarily for their utility, but to signal their wealth and social status to others. Think about luxury brands for a moment. A designer handbag that costs $4,000 doesn't function significantly better than one that costs $40. The markup is not primarily about material quality. It's about what carrying that bag communicates to the world and to yourself. And before you think this only applies to obviously luxury items, understand that this dynamic plays out at every price point. The person buying a slightly more expensive version of a basic item, the person choosing a brand name over a generic equivalent, the person upgrading to the newest phone model a year before their current one stopped working, all of these decisions carry layers of social and identity signaling beneath the surface. Let me bring up another fascinating mechanism called loss aversion, because it plays a huge role in unnecessary purchases, specifically through the lens of deals and limited-time offers. Loss aversion is the principle established by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, which describes how the psychological pain of losing something is roughly twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining something equivalent. So when you see a sale that says 50% off today only, your brain is not just thinking about gaining a discounted item, your brain is thinking about losing the opportunity to get that discounted item. The urgency and scarcity framing of marketing is almost entirely based on exploiting loss aversion. You were never going to buy that thing at full price, but introduce a countdown timer, a limited stock warning, or a phrase like, "This deal ends at midnight," and suddenly not buying it feels like a loss. You end up purchasing things you wouldn't have wanted otherwise simply to avoid the psychological discomfort of missing out. This connects beautifully to FOMO, or fear of missing out, which in the age of social media has become a purchasing accelerant unlike anything that existed in previous generations. When you are constantly exposed to curated images of other people's lives, their vacations, their apartments, their wardrobes, their gadgets, you are being subjected to a continuous stream of social comparison data, and your brain processes that data in ways that directly influence your purchasing behavior. You see something someone else has, you feel a gap between your life and that portrayed life, and purchasing something becomes a way of closing that perceived gap. The product becomes a bridge between who you currently are and who you want to be or want to appear to be. Marketers understand this profoundly, and the rise of influencer culture is essentially the industrialization of social comparison as a sales mechanism. Here's something that will genuinely shift your perspective. There's a psychological concept called the endowment effect, which describes how we assign greater value to things simply because we own them, or because we feel like they are already ours. This is why free trials work so well. This is why car dealerships encourage you to take a test drive and sit with the vehicle. This is why online shopping carts feel different from browsing a shelf.
Once you have mentally claimed something, even temporarily, letting it go feels like a loss. The object has already been partially integrated into your sense of self before you've even bought it. And so completing the purchase feels less like acquiring something new and more like confirming something that was already yours. Brilliant and slightly terrifying when you see it clearly. Now, let's talk about what happens after the purchase, specifically a phenomenon called post-purchase rationalization. This is where your brain, having made a decision it might not be entirely proud of, works overtime to convince you that the decision was actually perfectly reasonable. Cognitive dissonance is the discomfort you feel when your actions conflict with your beliefs. If you believe yourself to be a financially responsible, level-headed person, and you just spent $200 on something you didn't need, your brain experiences dissonance. And rather than sitting with that discomfort, it resolves the tension by adjusting your beliefs. Suddenly, you find yourself convincing yourself, and possibly others, that the purchase was actually quite strategic, a long-term investment, something you really will use constantly.
What is also fascinating here is something called choice supportive bias, which is the tendency to remember your chosen options as having been better than they actually were, and your rejected options as having been worse than they were. Over time, this means that even purchases that brought you minimal satisfaction get mentally upgraded in your memory, which is partly why the purchasing cycle keeps repeating. Not only do you rationalize purchases after making them, but you also selectively remember past purchases as having been more satisfying than they truly were. The feedback loop never gets honest data, so it never gets corrected. I want to take a moment and talk about something that does not get discussed nearly enough in conversations about unnecessary purchases, and that is the role of identity anchoring. We buy things not just to project an identity outward, but to anchor an internal sense of self. When you buy running shoes, you are not just buying shoes. You are investing in the identity of being a person who runs. When you buy an expensive notebook, you are not just buying a place to write. You are investing in the identity of being a person who takes ideas seriously. When you buy a guitar that ends up in the corner of your room, you are not being irrational in the moment. You are purchasing a version of yourself. The objects we choose to bring into our lives become physical manifestations of our aspirational identities. And this is psychologically powerful because our self-concept is not fixed. It is constantly being constructed and maintained through our environment, our choices, and yes, our possessions. But here's the deeper question I want you to sit with. If so much of our purchasing behavior is driven by psychological mechanisms that operate largely beneath conscious awareness, what does that mean for our sense of agency? Are we actually making free choices when we buy things we do not need? Or are we simply acting out scripts written by evolutionary pressures, social conditioning, and industrial-scale behavioral engineering? I think the honest answer is that it is some of both. We are never completely free from these influences, but awareness creates a gap between stimulus and response, and in that gap lies genuine choice. The goal is not to become some kind of ascetic who never enjoys buying things. The goal is to understand the machinery well enough that you can decide when you want to run it consciously and when you want to step back from it. There is a practical framework that some psychologists and financial therapists recommend called the identity check, and it goes something like this. Before you make a purchase that feels emotionally charged, ask yourself 3 questions. First, which version of me is making this decision right now? The calm, values-aligned version or the anxious, comparison-driven, impulsive version? Second, am I buying this because it genuinely serves my life or because I am trying to construct or communicate an identity? Third, will I still want this in 72 hours? That last one is particularly powerful because the research on impulse purchasing consistently shows that a significant portion of unnecessary purchases would not survive a 2 to 3 day waiting period. The emotional charge dissipates, the dopamine anticipation fades, and you are left with a much clearer view of whether the thing actually aligns with what you value. Another dimension worth exploring is the concept of hedonic adaptation, which is the proven psychological
biological tendency for humans to return to a relatively stable baseline of happiness, regardless of positive or negative life changes. You buy something exciting, you get a temporary boost, you adapt to the new normal, and then the excitement fades. This is sometimes called the hedonic treadmill, and it is one of the more humbling discoveries in positive psychology research because it means that the model of happiness through accumulation is fundamentally undermined by our own neurological design. We are wired to adapt. What delighted you 6 months ago barely registers today, which means that the pursuit of lasting satisfaction through purchasing is always going to feel like running toward a horizon. You move, it moves. The distance stays the same. Understanding hedonic adaptation also helps explain why experiences tend to generate more lasting satisfaction than possessions. Researchers have found that experiential purchases, things like travel, concerts, shared meals, and learning, tend to resist hedonic adaptation more effectively than material ones, partly because experiences are integrated into your personal narrative and become part of your identity over time in a way that objects often do not, partly because experiences are often social and therefore carry the relational warmth that human beings genuinely need to flourish. This is not an argument that you should never buy anything. It is an invitation to notice whether the things you are buying are the kinds of things that tend to generate genuine, ongoing value in your life, or whether they are quick dopamine loops dressed up as investments in your well-being. Now let me bring this all together with something I find genuinely profound, which is the concept of conscious consumption. There are people who have done the psychological work of understanding their own purchasing patterns, who have identified their specific emotional triggers, whether that's boredom, social comparison, stress, a desire for novelty, a fear of missing out, and who have developed practices that allow them to engage with the marketplace in a way that actually reflects their values. They still buy things, they still enjoy things, but the relationship with objects and with the act of purchasing has fundamentally shifted. Instead of purchases being primarily reactions to emotional states or social pressures, they become deliberate expressions of genuine values and needs. The difference between those two modes of engaging with consumption is not about how much you spend. It's about the quality of your awareness at the moment of decision.
I also want to acknowledge something important here. The forces driving unnecessary purchases are not distributed equally. Marketing systems specifically target people who are in emotional distress, who feel economically insecure, who are socially isolated, or who have been conditioned through their upbringing to associate purchasing with love, safety, or reward. Understanding the psychology of unnecessary purchases is not about judging yourself or others for falling into these patterns. It is about recognizing that you are operating within a system that has invested enormous resources into understanding human psychology, specifically in order to extract purchasing behavior from you. Having compassion for yourself in the face of that is not weakness. It is actually the foundation of any genuine change. The research on spending behavior also shows something really important, which is that people who develop what psychologists call a mindful relationship with money, meaning they have examined their emotional and psychological associations with spending, tend to report higher levels of overall life satisfaction, not because they spend less necessarily, though often they do, but because they spend more intentionally. They experience less post-purchase regret, they have fewer financial stressors, and they have a clearer sense of what actually brings them lasting satisfaction versus what just temporarily alleviates discomfort. The money you spend is, at its core, a representation of your time and energy. How you choose to deploy it is one of the most personal and consequential expressions of your values. So here is where I want to leave you. The psychology behind unnecessary purchases is not some dark conspiracy, though it does involve some pretty sophisticated manipulation. It is fundamentally the story of what it means to be a human being in a complex modern world, with ancient emotional needs meeting industrial-scale consumer systems that are extremely good at speaking the language of those needs. dopamine anticipation, loss aversion, social signaling, identity anchoring, hedonic adaptation, the arrival fallacy, these are not character flaws. They are the operating system. And like any operating system, you can either run it unconsciously, or you can learn enough about it to make deliberate choices about when to follow its defaults and when to override them. Next time you feel that pull towards something you probably do not need, see if you can pause for just a moment and get curious about what is actually happening underneath that feeling. Not to shame yourself out of wanting things, but to understand yourself well enough to know whether this is a purchase that will genuinely serve your life, or whether it is your brain doing exactly what decades of extremely well-funded behavioral research has trained it to do. That moment of curiosity is not just financially valuable. It is one of the most powerful acts of self-knowledge available to you. If this video got you thinking, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to go deeper on the psychology of decision-making and how to take back more conscious control over your choices, there is a lot more where this came from. I will see you in the next one. Like, comment, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more videos helping you with investing, personal finance, and more. Check out this playlist of my top videos of personal picks, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.